Imagine a secret so powerful, so intimately tied to the world's most influential families, that it could rewrite history books and shatter dynasties in a single breath. Now picture the one person entrusted with protecting that secret, the individual standing in the shadows, seeing everything yet sworn to silence. For centuries, bodyguards have been the silent witnesses to the most extraordinary lives, privy to scandals that never reached the newspapers and romances that defied all convention. These guardians of the elite carried truths that could topple empires, yet their vows of confidentiality turned them into living vaults of the world's most tantalizing secrets. But what happens when the weight of those secrets becomes too heavy to bear? When the human need to confess overrides a lifetime of discipline? Welcome to the shadowy intersection of duty and desire, where the protectors of royalty and Gilded Age heiresses occasionally break their sacred silence. This isn't just about security details or protective protocols. It's about the profound emotional complexities that arise when someone becomes both guardian and confidant, witness and accomplice. These individuals didn't just shield their charges from physical harm. They became keepers of their most vulnerable moments, their illicit affairs, their hidden fears, and their greatest shames. They operated in a world of unimaginable opulence and staggering power, where a single misplaced word could trigger international incidents or destroy legendary fortunes. Yet within these relationships, something remarkable often transpired. The rigid boundaries between employer and protector blurred into something far more human, far more complicated. Today, we pull back the velvet curtain on this mesmerizing world of whispered confessions and shocking revelations. We'll explore stories where bodyguards cross the line from silent sentinels to unexpected narrators, sharing truths that redefine our understanding of history's most guarded figures. From royal palaces to Fifth Avenue mansions, these protectors carried secrets that would make even the most seasoned scandal monger gasp. What drove them to break their vows? Was it conscience, compassion, or something more personal? Join us on this extraordinary journey through the hidden corridors of power, where the most fascinating stories often came from those who were never supposed to speak at all. To truly appreciate the gravity of these confessions, we must first step into the polished shoes of the bodyguard themselves and understand the extraordinary world they inhabited. This was not a mere job. It was an all-consuming vocation that demanded a complete sublimation of self. The primary currency in this rarefied atmosphere was not strength or tactical skill, though those were essential, but an unwavering, granite-like discretion. A bodyguard's value was measured in their silence. They were trained to be a living, breathing part of the architecture present, alert, yet utterly invisible. They saw clandestine lovers slip through service entrances, witnessed tearful breakdowns in gilded hallways, and overheard phone calls that could move markets or destabilize governments. Their minds became archives of the most sensitive information imaginable, yet their faces had to remain impassive masks, revealing nothing. Beyond the vow of silence lay a treacherous social labyrinth. The bodyguard's role was a paradox. They were both insider and outsider, granted intimate access, yet forever barred from true belonging. They had to navigate the unspoken rules of aristocratic protocol with the precision of a diplomat, knowing exactly when to avert their gaze, how to address a duke versus a dowager duchess, in which family secrets were too volatile to even acknowledge. The threat of scandal was a constant humming tension in the air. A single photograph snapped at the wrong moment, an offhand remark overheard by a servant, or even a slight change in demeanor could ignite a media firestorm or cause irreparable damage to a centuries-old reputation. The Bodyguards stood as the first and last line of defense against this perpetual danger, a human shield against not just bullets, but against gossip, exposure, and social ruin. This immense pressure created a unique and often isolating psychological burden. They shared the most intense moments of their principals' lives, moments of terror, joy, heartbreak, and vulnerability, yet could never process these events with anyone else. There were no debriefings for emotional trauma. They bottled up everything, forming bonds of profound intimacy that were, by design, entirely one-sided. They knew the deepest fears of the person they protected, yet that person might not even know their first name. This emotional dissonance, being the keeper of someone's entire truth, while your own existence is meticulously erased from the narrative, creates a pressure cooker of the human spirit. It is from this crucible of extreme duty, social complexity, and profound isolation that the compelling and often shocking impulse to confess finally emerges. The silence they were hired to keep eventually becomes a weight they can no longer bear alone. Our first glimpse into this world of fractured silence takes us to the gilded cage of a European palace, where tradition and duty weighed as heavily as the crown jewels. The principal in this story was a young princess, often portrayed in the press as the very picture of royal decorum, poised, obedient, and predictable. But behind the marble pillars and beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, an entirely different person existed. Her bodyguard, a man we'll refer to as Stefan to protect identities, found himself at the center of a truth far more compelling than the public facade. His confession, shared years later, paints a portrait of a vibrant young woman chafing against the constraints of her birthright, yearning for a taste of the freedom everyone else took for granted. It began with a faint click of a door latched long after midnight. Stefan, on his routine patrol, didn't confront her immediately. He simply observed. He watched the princess, dressed not in couture, but in a simple, dark coat and jeans, move with a practiced silence through the palace's servant corridors. Her destination was never the family's secured garages that would be too easily monitored. Instead, a beat-up motorcycle, prearranged and hidden in a grove of trees just beyond the royal grounds, was her chariot of freedom. Stefan was faced with an impossible choice: apprehend her and trigger a monumental scandal that would shatter the royal family's carefully constructed image, or follow her into the night to ensure her safety, effectively becoming a participant in her deception. He chose the latter, his professional duty to protect her physical person overriding the strict protocol that demanded her confinement. His role rapidly evolved from protector to active accomplice. He became her shadow, using his training not to restrain her, but to facilitate her clandestine meetings. He would scout ahead for paparazzi, secure back entrances to bohemian cafes and art studios, and create diversions to allow her to slip away unnoticed. The object of these midnight escapes was a fiercely controversial artist, a man whose work openly criticized the very institution the princess represented. Their meetings were less a grand romance and more a mutual act of rebellion, a shared breath of unscripted reality. Stefan describes the princess in those moments as truly alive for the first time, her laughter unguarded and her opinions unfiltered, a stark contrast to the serene mask she wore for official portraits. The most profound tension for Stefan wasn't the fear of getting caught. It was the psychological tightrope he was forced to walk. He was now the keeper of her deepest secret, lying daily to her parents, her security detail, and the palace staff. He crafted elaborate alibis for her unexplained absences, blaming faulty alarm sensors or claiming she was in a part of the palace with poor communication. This required a constant, draining performance. Yet, within this conspiracy, a strange and powerful bond formed. The princess, aware of his complicity, began to trust him implicitly. She would share her frustrations and dreams during their long drives back to the palace in the pre-dawn light. Conversations that blurred the line between employer and confidant. He was no longer just her guard. He was the sole witness to her authentic self. This intimacy made his eventual confession so powerful. It wasn't just a story of royal rebellion, but a testament to the human connection forged in the silence they shared, a secret that honored the real woman behind the crown by finally telling her truth. While the princess sought freedom from her gilded cage, another type of rebellion was unfolding across the Atlantic, fueled not by ancient tradition, but by dazzling new money. This next confession transports us to the opulent world of a Gilded Age heiress, a young woman whose name was synonymous with American royalty. To the public, she was the epitome of her family's carefully manufactured image, polished, privileged, and perpetually poised for a suitable marriage that would further cement their dynasty. But her personal bodyguard, a man whose loyalty was purchased along with his crisp suit, knew a far more compelling truth. His story isn't just about protecting a person. It's about safeguarding a secret romance that threatened to burn her entire world to the ground. The object of her affection was what made the situation so volatile. He wasn't a Vanderbilt or in a store. He was her chauffeur. Their world could not have been more different. She inhabited a universe of ballrooms, cotillions, and inherited wealth so vast it was abstract. He lived in the tangible world of machinery, petrol, and a hard day's work. Their connection began not in a grand ballroom, but in the back of a Rolls Royce, during long, quiet drives where the partition between the front and back seats became a metaphor she eventually dared to tear down. The bodyguard, stationed as always in the passenger seat, became the silent witness to the first furtive glances, the initially polite conversations that gradually deepened into something far more meaningful. He saw the exact moment a professional relationship transformed into a dangerous and utterly forbidden intimacy. His role quickly escalated from mere observer to essential courier. The heiress, aware her correspondence was monitored by a strict social secretary and a domineering mother, could not risk a single letter falling into the wrong hands. The bodyguard became their postal service. He describes the precise, almost ritualistic way she would hand him the folded notes, never sealed, as a sign of her absolute trust in his discretion. The paper was always of the highest quality, the handwriting elegant and flowing, yet the words within were raw and real, filled with a passion utterly absent from her sterile high society life. He would then deliver them not to the chauffeur's hands directly, but to a pre-agreed hiding spot in the garage, tucked inside the folded leather of driving goggles, or slipped into the pages of a maintenance manual. This dead drop system minimized their direct contact and protected all three of them from discovery. But letters could only sustain the romance for so long. The real test of the bodyguards' complicity came when they devised a plan to meet in person. This required an elaborate theatrical production of deception, for which the bodyguard was both stage manager and supporting actor. It began with the heiress feigning a newfound, intense interest in philanthropy. She would announce her intention to spend the day visiting a list of charitable foundations, a cause so upright and boring her family rarely questioned it. The bodyguard would then provide the verified and completely fabricated itinerary to the household. The car would pull away from the mansion, but instead of heading to the dreary offices of charity boards, it would speed toward a prearranged rendezvous, a secluded artist's studio loaned by a sympathetic friend, or a quiet inn far outside the city limits. The most psychologically complex part of the bodyguard's duty was not the active deception, but the profound emotional dissonance he was forced to manage. During these clandestine meetings, his job was to stand watch, to ensure their secret was safe. He would position himself where he could see all approaches, his posture that of a professional protector, while just meters away, his charge experienced the only moments of genuine happiness he had ever witnessed in her. He was paid an enormous salary by her father to uphold the family's honor, yet he was actively facilitating its greatest potential scandal. He knew that if discovered, the chauffeur would be dismissed without a reference and blacklisted from any respectable employment, while the heiress would be shipped off to Europe in disgrace, her spirit likely broken forever. His confession reveals he wasn't motivated by romance or idealism, but by a growing respect for the two individuals and a quiet disdain for the oppressive social machine they were fighting against. He wasn't just guarding a person, he was guarding a moment of pure, defiant authenticity in a world choked by pretense. This relentless cycle of debt and deception placed the bodyguard in an impossible ethical position. He watched as the prince's personality transformed under the strain, the charming public figure replaced by a desperate, anxious, and often volatile man in private. The bodyguard's duty expanded far beyond physical protection. He became a crisis manager, a financial mule, and an emotional shock absorber. He was the one who had to calmly negotiate with intimidating creditors in back rooms, assuring them of imminent payment from the family office. He was the one who had to intercept and destroy invoices and threatening letters before they reached the prince's wife or advisors. The most harrowing part of his confession describes the psychological toll of maintaining this double life. At official events, he would stand stoically behind a prince who was smiling and waving to adoring crowds, while internally, the bodyguard was calculating which asset might be sold next to cover the latest losses, or scanning the room for any journalist who might have gotten a whisper of the truth. He was protecting the prince not from assassins, but from the consequences of his own self-destruction, all to preserve a lie that benefited the institution but destroyed the man. The fear of exposure was a constant, suffocating presence. Every ringing phone, every unfamiliar face in the crowd, Every tabloid headline about royal troubles was a potential catastrophe. The bodyguard's confession reveals the elaborate counter-surveillance measures he was ordered to implement. He would sweep the prince's private quarters for listening devices after every trip to a gaming club. He was tasked with running background checks on casino staff and even fellow aristocrats who joined the games, ensuring no one was wearing a hidden camera or recording conversations. The royal household had a designated, discreet law firm and a private bank on permanent standby, not for matters of state, but to manage the financial fallout and legally threaten anyone who attempted to go public with the story. This was a massive, silent operation running parallel to the prince's official life, a shadow institution dedicated solely to containing his addiction. The bodyguard wasn't just a guard. He was a key soldier in a secret war against scandal, and the battlefield was the prince's own life. His ultimate confession was driven by the haunting realization that in saving the prince's reputation, he had perhaps participated in enabling a disease that was consuming him from the inside out. The glittering world of Fifth Avenue ballrooms and European tours concealed threats far more insidious than any physical assailant. As one bodyguard to a railroad heiress discovered in the most chilling way possible. His principal was the embodiment of new American wealth, young, beautiful, and with a fortune so fresh it practically sparked, making her a perfect target for those who preyed on privilege from the shadows. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a single, innocuous-looking envelope left on a silver salver in the mansion's foyer. It contained no letter, only a set of grainy but unmistakable photographs showing the heiress in a moment of vulnerable intimacy with a prominent and very married political figure. The accompanying note was a masterpiece of cold, calculated menace, demanding an astronomical sum for the negatives and offering a 2-day deadline before the images were sent to every major newspaper in the country. The bodyguard, a man named Edward, immediately understood the devastating calculus of the situation. Going to the family patriarch, a notoriously rigid and vindictive industrialist, was not an option. His response would be swift and brutal, likely focusing his fury on salvaging the family name by disowning his daughter and destroying the politician's career, leaving the heiress emotionally and financially ruined. Informing the police was equally impossible. The scandal would leak instantly, achieving the blackmailer's goal without him collecting a dime. Edward realized with a sinking certainty that he was the only person standing between his charge and utter disaster. The protocols he was sworn to follow were useless. This demanded an unsanctioned, completely deniable operation, run entirely off the books. His first move was one of psychological triage. He had to inform the heiress, as the threat was directed at her, but he did so with a surgeon's precision, isolating her in the library and presenting the facts without a shred of emotion. He watched the color drain from her face, not from shame, but from the terrifying realization that her entire future was no longer her own. In that moment, their relationship shifted irrevocably. He was no longer just an employee. He was her sole ally in a silent war. She placed her complete trust in him, a burden heavier than any firearm he'd ever carried. Edward's investigation was a masterclass in applied tradecraft, using his network of contacts from his past life in law enforcement. The blackmailer, arrogantly confident, had used a cheap prepaid courier service for the delivery. Edward traced the package back to a nondescript intermediary office, but instead of questioning the clerk, a move that would surely alert the blackmailer, he simply loitered, buying a coffee and making casual conversation. He learned the client was a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit who paid in cash. The description was generic, but the choice of intermediary was a clue. It pointed to a professional, not an amateur. This was someone who knew how to create layers of insulation. The break came from a different angle entirely. Edward recalled a disgruntled former household photographer, a man let go months prior for drinking on the job, who had made vague, threatening remarks about the family, getting what was coming to them on his way out. Edward discreetly pulled the heiress's social calendar from the period hinted at in the photos, cross-referencing the date and location of the political fundraiser with the photographer's known haunts. He found a match, a seedy bar a block from the event venue. The man had the motive, the opportunity, and the skill. Edward now had a target. The retrieval itself was a tense, nocturnal affair. The photographer, it turned out, was not a criminal mastermind, but a desperate fool. He was operating out of a rundown studio apartment, and Edward gained entry not through force, but through a simple ruse involving a fake delivery. The man was terrified, expecting the family's lawyers or thugs, not a single, calm bodyguard. Edward didn't lay a hand on him. He simply laid out the reality of the situation with cold, terrifying clarity. He explained that the family wasn't here paying because they didn't know. It was just him. And while the family would sue the photographer into oblivion and have him jailed, Edward himself was the wild card, the man whose entire career was now on the line because of this stupidity. He offered a single, stark choice: hand over every negative, every print, and every digital copy immediately, and simply walk away. Or he could deal with the consequences of a man with nothing left to lose. The choice was made in a panicked instant. The photographer produced a small lockbox from under his bed, his hands shaking. Edward meticulously checked the contents, ensuring every piece of evidence was accounted for before taking the entire box. He stood there for a long moment, watching the man crumple in relief and fear, before issuing a final, quiet warning to leave the city and never speak of this to anyone. The return to the mansion was made in the deepest hours of the night. Edward presented the lockbox to the heiress without ceremony. The operation was over. There was no celebration, only a shared, profound exhaustion and the unspoken understanding that some secrets are so powerful, they forge a bond stronger than any employment contract. A connection built in the silent ashes of a shared catastrophe averted. Yet even the most disciplined professional is not immune to the heart's unexpected betrayals. A truth painfully learned by a guard assigned to a young, widowed duchess. His assignment began as one of solemn duty, protecting a woman enveloped in a shroud of profound grief. The grand estate felt more like a mausoleum than a home, every room echoing with the absence of her late husband. For months, his role was one of silent witness to her sorrow, a figure of quiet strength in the periphery of her shattered world. He ensured her safety while she navigated the unbearable rituals of mourning, his presence a constant, impersonal shield against a world eager for a glimpse of her pain. The boundary between them felt absolute, a chasm of status and circumstance that was never meant to be crossed. The shift was so gradual, it was almost imperceptible. As the sharpest edges of her grief began to soften, he saw flickers of the woman she had been before tragedy struck. It started with a shared glance of weary understanding during a long, silent car ride, or a moment of unexpected laughter at a comment he made about a particularly pompous visiting dignitary. These tiny cracks in the professional facade began to widen into something more dangerous. He found himself not just protecting her, but genuinely seeing her resilience, her sharp wit that was slowly reemerging, the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. The emotional intimacy of being her sole constant companion in a lonely world began to warp his professional judgment, blurring the lines between dutiful observation and personal affection. The affair itself was a fleeting explosion of forbidden emotion, conducted in the hushed secrecy her position demanded. A whispered conversation in a secluded garden that lasted a moment too long. A hand offered for support that was not immediately released. It was a mutual collapse of boundaries, born from her profound loneliness and his misplaced compassion that had curdled into desire. For a handful of weeks, the ancient walls of the estate held their secret, the guard using his own expertise in evasion to create moments of privacy that defied all protocol. The guilt was immediate and crushing for him. Every tender moment was shadowed by the terrifying knowledge that he was betraying the very trust his position was built upon, compromising not only his career, but her fragile reputation. His confession reveals it was he who ended it, not out of a lack of feeling, but from an overwhelming surge of professional shame. The realization that he had become the very threat from which he was sworn to protect her, a threat to her standing, her honor, and her fragile peace, was a devastating self-indictment. He terminated the assignment himself, requesting an immediate transfer to a distant post under the flimsiest of pretexts, leaving her confused and hurt without any explanation he could possibly give. For decades, he has carried the dual burden of the memory itself and the cowardice of his abrupt departure, a permanent stain on his record of service that only he knows exists. His is not a confession of scandalous triumph, but one of quiet remorse, a testament to the human fallibility that can lurk beneath the most stoic exterior and the heavy price of crossing a line that was never meant to be approached. To truly grasp the magnitude of these confessions, we must venture beyond the physical job description and into the intricate psychology of the protector. The bodyguard's mind exists in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, a constant, draining scan for potential threats in every crowd, every reflection, every sudden movement. This isn't a switch that gets turned off at the end of a shift. It becomes a permanent lens through which they view the entire world. Theirs is a life of calculated risk assessment, where a casual tourist with a camera can be perceived as a potential stalker. And a loud noise isn't just a sound, but a potential catalyst for chaos. This relentless state of readiness, while essential for the job, exacts a heavy psychic toll, leading to a form of occupational conditioning that makes relaxation and ordinary civilian life profoundly difficult to engage in. This psychological strain is compounded by the uniquely intimate yet strictly one-sided relationships they are required to maintain. Imagine spending 12, 14, 16 hours a day with a single individual, attuned to their every mood, their subtle tells of anxiety or fatigue, their private habits and unguarded moments. You learn the rhythm of their breathing when they are calm, the specific way they sigh when frustrated, the real smile they reserve for trusted friends versus the polished public version. This creates a powerful sense of emotional intimacy and, frequently, a fierce protective instinct that goes far beyond the job description. Yet this connection is almost never reciprocal. You are a fixture, a part of the security apparatus. This profound asymmetry, knowing someone more deeply than most of their friends or family ever will, while remaining essentially invisible to them as a person with your own inner life, creates a deep-seated cognitive dissonance that can only be resolved through extreme compartmentalization. It is within this pressure cooker of proximity and emotional isolation that the most complex bonds are forged. The relationship dynamic is never simply employer and employee. In moments of genuine danger or high stress, a primal, almost tribal alliance forms instantly. You become a single unit, acting and reacting in sync. A connection forged in adrenaline that can feel more significant than any other. For the principal, the bodyguard often becomes a silent anchor, a non-judgmental presence in a world filled with sycophants and critics. They are the one person who isn't there for a favor, an investment, or a story. This can lead to a level of trust so absolute that the principal begins to confide in them, sharing fears, frustrations, and secrets they would tell no one else. The bodyguard, in turn, is placed in the impossible position of being both a paid professional and the sole keeper of another human being's most vulnerable truths. This brings us to the monumental weight of the code of silence. This is not merely a clause in an employment contract. It is a core tenet of their professional identity, an ethical bedrock. Breaking it is considered the ultimate betrayal, a transgression that can exile a person from the entire close-knit community of protection professionals. The code is sacrosanct because the entire system relies on absolute trust. Royals, celebrities, and billionaires hire these individuals because they believe, on a fundamental level, that their private lives will remain private. The bodyguard is the living embodiment of that promise. To speak is to shatter that trust completely, not just for themselves, but for every colleague in their field, casting a shadow of doubt on the entire profession. So why, then, do these confessions happen? What powerful force could ever override a lifetime of discipline and a deeply ingrained honor code? The motivations are as complex and varied as the individuals themselves. For some, it is a late-in-life act of moral reckoning, a need to unburden their soul of a truth they have carried for decades before they are no longer able to speak it. The secret becomes a cancer of conscience, and confession is the only possible cure. For others, it is a final act of loyalty to the principle they served, not to the institution, but to the human being. They may believe that history has misunderstood their charge, and their testimony is offered as a corrective, a way to show the vulnerable, real person behind the public myth, to add a layer of humanity to a one-dimensional caricature. Sometimes the motivation is far less noble but profoundly human, a simple, aching need for recognition. After a lifetime of being professionally invisible, of having their most heroic or harrowing experiences erased from the official record, some feel a compulsion to finally say, "I was there. I saw it. My story matters too." It is a claim to personhood after decades of being treated as a sentient piece of furniture. And in rare cases, it is an act of controlled defiance, a way to reclaim a sliver of power from the powerful. For years, they held the secrets of those who held all the cards. In speaking, they finally play their own hand, demonstrating that the person in the shadows ultimately controls the light. But the most coldly calculated breach of trust often occurs not to protect a person, but to protect a price tag, as one guard's shocking confession from the heart of the Gilded Age reveals. The principal was a notoriously vain society matron, a woman whose sense of self-worth was directly tied to the opulence she could display at the weekly opera. Her most prized possession was not a child or a virtue, but a diamond necklace, a gaudy waterfall of stones so excessive it was practically a parody of wealth. The guard, a man deeply proud of his professional integrity, found his ethics tested not by an external criminal, but by the corrupt machinery of the very household he served. The crisis erupted one Tuesday morning. The lady's maid, a skittish young woman with a gambling problem known to the senior staff, had failed to return the necklace to the vault after the previous evening's event. A frantic, hushed search of her quarters revealed not the jewels, but a pawn ticket tucked under her mattress. She had stolen the necklace to cover her debts, an inside job of breathtaking stupidity given the item's uniqueness and fame. The expected course was clear: alert the police, have the maid arrested, and recover the jewels from the pawnbroker. But the matron's reaction was not one of outrage toward the thief, but of sheer, undiluted panic at the prospect of public exposure. The scandal of being robbed by one's own servant was, to her, a social death sentence far worse than the financial loss. This is where the guard's world turned upside down. Instead of calling the authorities, the family patriarch summoned him to the library and laid out a new, unsanctioned operation. The real crime was to be covered up, and a new, fictional one was to be constructed in its place. The maid would be quietly dismissed with a severance package and a terrifyingly clear threat about the consequences of ever speaking a word. The necklace would be discreetly retrieved from the pawn shop by the guard himself, using family funds. But it could never reappear in the family vault. The only acceptable solution, they decreed, was to stage a burglary. The insurance company would pay the claim, the family would avoid humiliation, and everyone would get what they wanted except, of course, for the guard's sense of honor. His confession details the grim, methodical process of fabricating the crime scene. Using his own expertise in security breaches, he had to carefully disable a specific window catch in the library without triggering any other alarms, making it look like the point of entry for a hypothetical cat burglar. He then had to meticulously ransack the very safe he was paid to protect, scattering unimportant documents and empty jewelry boxes to simulate a frantic search. The most psychologically jarring moment came when he was ordered to take a fireplace poker and deliver a single, convincing blow to his own head, just hard enough to draw blood and leave a bruise. He would be the hero of the story, the vigilant guard who interrupted the thief and was struck down for his efforts, allowing the criminal to escape with the loot. He was to lie not just with his words, but with his own injured body. The performance that followed was a masterpiece of deceit. He played his part flawlessly, staggering into the main hall with a bloody brow, raising the alarm with perfectly feigned disorientation and guilt. The police arrived and took his statement, commending his bravery. The insurance adjusters, while suspicious of the convenient timing after the opera, had no evidence to contest the claim. The family collected a massive payout. The guard, however, collected a deep and permanent stain on his professional soul. He had used his skills not to protect and serve, but to perpetuate a massive fraud. He became a living prop in a play designed to protect the vanity of the wealthy, his integrity sacrificed for a lie. His confession decades later was not driven by a desire for notoriety, but by a need to finally tell the truth about a world where the appearance of honor was always more valuable than the real thing. But of all the secrets a bodyguard might carry, few are as potentially explosive as the existence of a hidden heir, a living, breathing secret that could challenge the very line of succession. Our final confession plunges us into the heart of this most dangerous game, a story not just of illicit romance, but of a dynasty's desperate attempt to control its own narrative by erasing a piece of itself. The principal was a European king, a man whose public image was that of a devoted family man and a steadfast ruler. His bodyguard, a man utterly dedicated to the crown, found his loyalty stretched to its absolute limit when he was ordered to become the sole architect of a deception that would last a lifetime. The affair itself was a poorly kept secret within the highest echelons of the royal court. The king's liaison with a captivating American actress during a state tour years prior was an open secret, a discreet indulgence that the palace machinery was well equipped to handle with payoffs and non-disclosure agreements. The crisis and the true secret arrived 9 months later in the form of a private communiqué from across the Atlantic. The actress had given birth to a son. This was not a matter that could be settled with a check and a signed document. This was a direct, biological challenge to the established order, a child whose very existence, if proven, could ignite a constitutional firestorm and provide the press with the story of the century. The bodyguard's confession details the moment he was summoned to the king's private study. He was not asked, he was commanded. His new, singular mission, operating entirely outside any official channel and reporting only to the king himself, was to manage this situation with absolute deniability. The goal was not to bring the child into the fold, but to ensure he remained forever outside of it, while simultaneously satisfying the king's own complex paternal curiosity. The bodyguard became a ghost, his travels expunged from official records, his communications using a complex cipher known only to him and his monarch. He was the one who arranged for the substantial, anonymous financial support delivered through a labyrinth of offshore trusts and shell corporations, ensuring the child's material comfort without ever providing a paper trail back to the palace. His most profound and ethically fraught duty, however, was facilitating the secret visits. Once or twice a year, under the guise of private diplomatic reconnaissance or family heritage tours, the bodyguard would orchestrate the king's escape from his own life. These were operations of breathtaking precision, involving private jets booked under aliases, entire hotel floors rented covertly through intermediaries, and a skeleton crew of security whose loyalty was beyond question and whose compensation was astronomical. The bodyguard would personally scout a neutral location, a private villa in the Swiss Alps, a secluded beach house in the Caribbean, and then usher the young boy and his mother into the king's temporary orbit for a few precious days. The psychological weight of these encounters was immense for everyone involved. The bodyguard describes watching the king, a figure of immense state power, transform into a strangely tentative and emotional man during these visits. He was not a king to this boy. He was a distant, generous uncle who brought elaborate gifts and seemed to hang on his every word. The bodyguard stood guard not just against potential paparazzi, but against the overwhelming tide of emotion in the room, the unspoken words, and the impossible reality of their relationship. He was protecting the king from the consequences of his own heart. The most harrowing aspect of his confession revolves around the extensive measures taken to hide the child's existence from the official royal family, particularly the queen. This required a level of deception that felt, to the bodyguard, like a personal betrayal of his oath to protect the entire institution. He had to actively mislead the queen's own security detail about the king's whereabouts, creating elaborate and false timelines for the monarch's schedule. He managed a separate, encrypted phone for the king's communications with the actress, a device that never left his own possession unless in the sovereign's hand. His entire existence became a monument to a single, devastating secret, and he knew that his own fate was now irrevocably tied to its keeping. He wasn't just a bodyguard. He was the living lock on a door that could never, ever be opened. This particular confession rips away the polished veneer of high society to reveal a startling ideological rebellion burning just beneath the surface. Our subject was the epitome of established wealth, the daughter of a notoriously ruthless coal baron. To her family and their circle, she was the perfect heiress, always impeccably dressed, flawlessly mannered, and endlessly dedicated to a whirl of shallow charity committees and interminable galas. Her public persona was a masterclass in conformity, a living monument to the very system that had built her family's fortune. But her bodyguard, a man hired for his discretion and his ability to blend into the background, soon discovered that the woman he was protecting was living two completely separate lives, and he was about to become the essential link between them. The first clues were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not observing her around the clock. He noticed she never seemed truly present at the lavish events she was forced to attend. Her smiles were a fraction too brief, her applause a half beat too late. The real woman seemed to emerge only in the quiet solitude of the car, where she would often slump in her seat, physically drained by the performance. The turning point came when he observed her, believing herself to be alone in her private library, meticulously altering an expensive gown with a pair of sewing shears, cutting away the sequins and pearls to create a plain, dark, and utterly unremarkable dress. She wasn't preparing for a ball, she was creating a disguise. Her secret was not a romantic affair, but a passionate, deeply held political conviction that stood in direct opposition to everything her family represented. While her father's company fought violently against unionization and environmental regulations, she was spending her nights under a false name, immersed in the burgeoning labor movement. Her bodyguard, a man we'll call James, found himself pulled into her orbit not through a direct confession, but through a series of unspoken requests that tested the boundaries of his duty. It began with a change to her evening schedule. She would instruct him to drive her to the declared charity gala, wait precisely 15 minutes after she entered, and then bring the car around to a deserted service alley where she would be waiting. Her ball gown swapped for the simple, altered dress, her hair hastily pinned up under a common felt hat. His role evolved from simple chauffeur to active conspirator. Using his knowledge of the city's layout and his training in counter-surveillance, he would plot intricate, circuitous routes to their real destination. Dusty union halls smelling of stale coffee and tobacco, cramped apartments filled with passionate organizers planning strikes, or hidden printing presses where radical pamphlets were run off in the dead of night. James's primary duty shifted from protecting her from physical harm to protecting her identity. He would stand watch at a distance, his posture that of a bored driver waiting for his employer, while his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings for anyone who might recognize the coal baron's daughter deep in conversation with the very people her father's private detectives were hired to bust. The most profound psychological challenge for James was the staggering hypocrisy he was forced to enable. He would spend his afternoons listening to the heiress's father rage against ungrateful rabble-rousers over lunch, then spend his evenings ensuring those same rabble-rousers remained safe and their meetings secret, all while protecting his daughter, who was funding their efforts with her own generous allowance. He was being paid a significant salary from the profits of the coal empire to secretly undermine it. The cognitive dissonance was immense. He found himself in the bizarre position of respecting her courage and conviction far more than the hollow posturing of the world she came from, even as he participated in the deception that made it all possible. His confession, shared decades later, is less about the scandal of her actions and more about the quiet heroism he witnessed. He describes the fire in her eyes when she spoke of workers' rights, a passion utterly absent during her family's dinners. He recalls the tangible sense of purpose she exuded in those grimy meeting rooms, a stark contrast to the listless society doll she pretended to be. For James, breaking his silence was not a betrayal of his professional code, but a final act of loyalty to the real woman he had sworn to protect, not just her physical safety, but the integrity of her secret and the authenticity of her remarkable double life. He wasn't just guarding a person, he was guarding a belief, and in the end, he decided that particular truth was too important to remain forever hidden. Even for a seasoned professional, few words strike more terror than the simple announcement that a principal is unaccounted for. The protocol for a missing person is clear, but the protocol for a missing prince at a private, high-stakes gathering is a labyrinth of unspoken rules and potential catastrophes. This particular confession, from a guard we'll call Thomas, details a night that began with routine surveillance at an exclusive, members-only club in Monte Carlo and spiraled into a heart-pounding exercise in controlled panic. The prince was a known socialite, charming and charismatic, but with a reckless streak that made him a constant source of low-grade anxiety for his detail. That night, however, his disappearance was different. He didn't simply slip away for a private conversation. He evaporated. The initial assumption was a romantic tryst. Thomas and his team gave him a discreet 15-minute window, using the time to casually sweep the club's known private rooms and balconies, their expressions neutral, their movements unhurried to avoid causing alarm among the other glittering guests. When that yielded nothing, the anxiety level ticked up. a quiet word with the club's impeccably dressed manager, a man who understood the value of discretion, granted them access to the security feeds. The grainy black and white footage showed the prince exiting a back service door, not with a lover, but alone, his posture slightly unsteady, and most alarmingly, he was followed at a distance by two large, unfamiliar men who did not have the relaxed demeanor of fellow partygoers. This was no longer a case of a royal playing hooky. This was a potential kidnapping in progress. Standard procedure would dictate an immediate alert to local police and Interpol, mobilizing every official resource. But Thomas knew that was the one option he could not take. A public search for a missing prince, especially in a city synonymous with scandal, would create a media firestorm that would rage for years. The implications were unthinkable: a political instability, market fluctuations, and a permanent stain on the monarchy. He had to solve this quietly, and he had to solve it now, using a tool set never mentioned in any official manual: the vast, shadowy network of favors and contacts that exists just beneath the surface of official society. His first call was not to a police commissioner, but to a retired security consultant, a former colleague who had gone private and now managed security for a constellation of wealthy and occasionally dubious clients across the Mediterranean. Thomas spoke in a coded language they both understood, conveying the extreme urgency and the absolute need for deniability. Within minutes, his phone began to buzz with text messages from numbers he didn't recognize, tips from off-duty casino security, a driver who remembered a specific car, whispers from the very underworld figures who might have been involved. This was the silent alarm bell, rung not for the authorities, but for the unofficial guardians of the elite's secrets. The break came from a source that would make any traditional law enforcement officer blanch. A known fixer, a man who specialized in making problems disappear for a price, contacted Thomas's intermediary. He'd heard a rumor that two low-level enforcers, in over their heads, had picked up a very loud, very wealthy tourist who had lost a fortune in a backroom game run by a local crime boss. The prince hadn't been kidnapped for political ransom. He'd been taken over a gambling debt he couldn't cover on the spot. The fixer provided an address, a nondescript villa in the hills, not out of altruism, but as a professional courtesy to maintain the fragile peace between the world of high-profile protection and the world of organized crime. The approach to the villa was a masterclass in tense, solo reconnaissance. Thomas went alone, knowing a full team would be seen as an aggressive move and could spook the captors into doing something drastic. He observed the property from a distance, noting the single guard at the door, the lack of sophisticated security. These were not professional kidnappers. They were thugs trying to collect a debt. Thomas made the calculated decision to walk right up to the front door, not as a commando, but as a negotiator. He presented himself calmly, not as a royal bodyguard, but as the prince's financial manager, there to settle accounts. The sheer audacity of it worked. He was led inside to a garishly decorated living room where he found the prince, disheveled and terrified, but unharmed. The relief that flooded Thomas was instantly tempered by a cold, consuming fury, not at the thugs, but at the prince whose stupidity had brought them to this precipice. The financial transaction was handled with a brutal efficiency that spoke volumes about this shadow world. Thomas had access to emergency funds for precisely this kind of incident, though he never imagined he'd use them for a gambling debt. The money was transferred electronically from a secure account, the digital equivalent of a suitcase full of unmarked bills. The receipt was a terse nod from the crime boss's lieutenant. No paperwork, no apologies. The prince was released into Thomas's custody without a word, the two of them walking out into the early dawn light like ghosts. The car ride back to the prince's hotel was conducted in a silence more punishing than any outburst of anger. The prince, shamefaced and trembling, kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Thomas's mind was already racing ahead, implementing the next phase of the operation, crafting the airtight cover story for the previous 8 hours, a fiction that would be sold to the rest of the royal household, the press, and history itself. The threat was over, but the betrayal of trust, the reckless endangerment of an entire nation's stability for a moment of thrill-seeking, was a wound that would never fully heal for the man paid to absorb such blows. The most heroic acts are often the ones wrapped in the tightest layers of secrecy, where the truth of a sacrifice becomes a story too dangerous to tell. Such was the case for a guard assigned to a beloved, yet tragically doomed, European countess, a woman whose radiance was matched only by her profound recklessness in matters of the heart. For years, the official record stated that she had been the target of a lone, deranged assassin's bullet during a public walk through a Viennese park, a random act of violence that shocked the nation. Her bodyguard, a decorated veteran named Karl, was hailed as a hero for leaping in front of the shot, taking the round in his shoulder and saving her life. He accepted the medals and the public accolades with a stoic grace, all the while holding onto the devastating truth that the entire narrative was a carefully constructed lie, a fiction designed to protect the Countess from a scandal far more damaging than a random attack. The reality of that day was infinitely more personal and more tragic. The Countess had been embroiled in a passionate, tumultuous affair with a highly decorated military officer, a man celebrated as a national hero. Their relationship, conducted in a whirlwind of stolen moments and grand gestures, had begun to unravel spectacularly in the weeks leading up to the shooting. The officer, a man of intense pride and a hair-trigger temper, could not accept her decision to end things. Karl had witnessed their final, furious confrontation just the night before in the gardens of her estate, overhearing the officer's threats veiled as pleas, his voice trembling with a dangerous mixture of heartbreak and rage. Karl had reported the incident to the family's head of security, recommending increased protection, but the Countess had dismissively waved it away, refusing to believe her former lover was truly capable of harming her. She believed his love for her would override his famous temper, a fatal miscalculation of the human heart. When the shot rang out in the park, Karl's training instantly pinpointed its origin, not from the crowd, but from a specific stand of trees where he had already noted a lone, still figure. As he moved to cover the Countess, his mind processed 1,000 details in a split second. The lack of a proper firing stance from the shooter, the anguished cry that accompanied the gunshot, the familiar set of the shoulders of the man now turning to flee. He knew instantly who it was and why he was there. This was no political extremist or anonymous madman. This was a crime of passion, a moment of catastrophic weakness from a celebrated man destroyed by rejected love. In the chaotic aftermath, as Carl lay bleeding on the gravel path, his first whispered words to the arriving head of security were not about his injury, but the identity of the attacker. The decision to conceal the truth was made in that instant. The consequences of revealing the officer's identity would have been apocalyptic for the family's reputation and for the nation itself. The Countess would have been painted not as an innocent victim, but as a reckless aristocrat whose affairs had driven a war hero to attempted murder. The ensuing media frenzy would have dissected her every prior relationship, turning a private tragedy into a sordid public spectacle. The officer's distinguished career and the military's pristine image would have been obliterated overnight. The family patriarch, upon hearing the news at the hospital, made the cold, pragmatic choice. The officer would be dealt with privately. His career ended with a sudden, unexplained, extended leave, followed by a quiet retirement to a distant country estate, where he would live out his days under a form of genteel house arrest. The public, however, would receive the story of the unknown assassin, a narrative that painted the Countess as a blameless victim of random fate and allowed a national hero to remain untarnished in the public's memory. Carl's confession, decades later, is haunted not by the physical pain of the wound, but by the psychological burden of the lie. He had to sit through official investigations and repeat the fabricated story to stone-faced detectives, his every word a betrayal of his own integrity. He had to look the Countess in the eye as she thanked him for saving her from a stranger, all while knowing he had actually saved her from a truth she was too fragile to confront. The medals he received felt like a mockery, honoring an act of duty that was genuine, but commemorating a fiction. His true heroism lay not in taking a bullet, but in willingly shouldering the immense weight of a secret that preserved a family's honor and a nation's idol at the cost of his own peace. He became the living repository for a truth that would have broken far more than just a shoulder, a silent guardian long after the physical danger had passed. Their effectiveness relied not on muscle alone, but on a sophisticated, often invisible toolkit designed for information control. Long before the digital age, these protectors were masters of the analog intercept. A mail, both incoming and outgoing, was a primary target. A skilled bodyguard knew how to steam open an envelope with the heat from a kettle, scan the contents for anything compromising, and reseal it without leaving a trace of tampering. This wasn't about reading love letters for gossip. It was a critical early warning system. A note from a blackmailer, a threatening message from a business rival, or even an innocent invitation to a risky location could be identified and neutralized before the principal ever laid eyes on it, saving them from distress and the household from potential scandal. The telephone presented another vulnerability, and the solutions were ingeniously crude. Early wiretapping involved alligator clips and a tape recorder hidden in a nearby room, allowing the bodyguard to monitor calls in real time. They weren't just listening for threats, but for shifts in tone, coded language, or the nervous hesitation of a caller that might indicate coercion or deception. This intimate access to private conversations provided a psychological profile of the people in their principal's orbit, helping them distinguish true friends from sycophants and potential predators. It was a relentless invasion of privacy, justified under the sacred banner of protection. Perhaps the most surprising tool in their arsenal was a calculated and often fraught relationship with the press. While paparazzi were generally seen as the enemy, a savvy bodyguard knew that a completely blacked-out media presence could be as damaging as a scandalous one. The solution was the controlled leak or the staged photo opportunity. A bodyguard might discreetly tip off a trusted photographer about a principal's attendance at a charity hospital visit, ensuring positive press that bolstered their image. Conversely, they might coordinate with reporters to drown out a damaging rumor by offering up a more benign but equally tantalizing piece of news. This delicate dance required a deep understanding of media appetites and a network of contacts within newsrooms, turning potential adversaries into unwitting pawns in a much larger game of public perception. This omnipresent surveillance extended to the people closest to the principal. Before a new staff member was hired, from a lowly kitchen maid to a high-ranking personal secretary, the bodyguards network would conduct a thorough background check. This wasn't a simple reference call. It involved discreet visits to previous employers, conversations with local shopkeepers in their hometown, and digging into family histories for any hint of financial trouble or moral looseness that could make them susceptible to bribery. Everyone was a potential security risk until proven otherwise. This constant, silent assessment created an atmosphere of pervasive scrutiny, where the protector was not only watching for external threats, but also constantly evaluating the loyalty of the very household they were embedded within. Fabricating a public image was perhaps the most surreal and ethically ambiguous duty a protector could be asked to perform, transforming a bodyguard from a shield against physical harm into an architect of perception. Our subject was a baroness whose name had become a byword for selfishness and excess. Her reputation left in tatters after a very public, very messy divorce that exposed her extravagant spending and shockingly callous private comments. She wasn't just disliked, she was actively reviled, a cartoonish villainess in the eyes of the press and the public. Her family, concerned less with her personal happiness and more with the toxic spillover affecting their business interests and social standing, decided her image required not a polish, but a complete and total rebuild from the ground up. And her bodyguard, a man trained in threat assessment and defensive driving, found himself suddenly heading an off-the-books Black Ops public relations campaign. The first phase of the operation was pure intelligence gathering, but of a uniquely personal nature. The bodyguard, whom we'll call Henry, was ordered to compile a dossier not on external threats, but on his principal's greatest weaknesses. For weeks, he discreetly cataloged her every gaffe and unguarded moment. He noted her habit of sighing with profound boredom when a charity organizer explained their mission, the way she would roll her eyes at children, and her tendency to make shockingly tone-deaf comments about money and poverty. This wasn't for blackmail, it was a diagnostic tool. Henry had to identify every single behavioral landmine so they could be systematically disarmed and replaced with carefully engineered alternatives. He was essentially building a psychological profile for a new person his principal would have to learn to play. The most audacious part of the campaign involved the stage management of her public appearances. Henry's job expanded to include location scouting for photo opportunities. He wouldn't just assess a soup kitchen for security risks. He would evaluate its lighting, its backdrop, and its potential for generating the most heartwarming imagery. He would then choreograph her arrival, her movements, and her interactions down to the smallest detail. He coached her on how to hold an orphaned puppy, precisely how long to gaze sincerely into the eyes of a homeless veteran, and the exact angle to turn her face so the cameras would catch a single, perfectly timed tear. These were not spontaneous moments of empathy. They were tactical maneuvers, each gesture designed and rehearsed like a scene in a play, with Henry acting as both director and stage manager. The manipulation extended to her very words. Henry found himself writing cue cards for her life. Before any public outing, he would drill her on a set of key, sympathetic phrases she was to work into conversations. We must all do our part. I've been so privileged, it's time to give back. This truly puts things in perspective. He taught her to speak more softly, to pause thoughtfully before answering questions, and to never, ever mention money, vacations, or expensive possessions. He became her dialogue coach, training the arrogance out of her speech patterns and replacing it with a manufactured humility that sounded utterly foreign coming from her mouth. The most surreal moments occurred in the car immediately after these performances, where the Baroness would often drop the act with a contemptuous sneer, complaining about the smell of the places she'd just visited and critiquing the quality of the free press she'd received. The final and most morally complex layer involved the active cultivation of the press. Henry, using his network of contacts, identified reporters known for writing soft, human interest features. He would then feed them exclusive and entirely manufactured stories about the Baroness's private heartache over her failed marriage, her secret health struggles, and her deep, lifelong passion for whichever cause she was currently pretending to champion. He provided them with the staged photographs to accompany these fictions. In exchange for these scoops, the reporters agreed to show him their pieces before publication, allowing him to edit out any phrasing that didn't fit the desired narrative. He wasn't just managing the news, he was writing it, transforming a bodyguard into a silent media mogul whose only product was a lie. His confession reveals that the greatest threat he ever neutralized wasn't a bullet, but the truth, and he did it all to protect the one thing his principal valued more than her honor, her social standing. Perhaps the most haunting duty a protector can face is not guarding a life, but guarding the lie about how it ended. Our final confession descends into this somber territory, a story that begins with a single, distant gunshot echoing through an otherwise peaceful autumn forest. The official report, released to a grieving public and a nervous international press, was concise and tragic. A beloved European duke, an avid hunter, had been killed in a horrific accident during a stag hunt on his family's ancestral estate. A stray shot, a misplaced step, a terrible twist of fate. The narrative was clean, noble even, and it allowed for a state funeral with full honors and a legacy left untarnished. But the Duke's personal bodyguard, a man who had been by his side for 20 years, carried the corrosive truth that the official story was a meticulously crafted deception, orchestrated not by malice, but by a desperate need to contain a catastrophe. The first and most devastating clue was the location of the body. The shot that killed the Duke did not come from the direction of the hunting party, where stray bullets might plausibly fly. The guard responding to the sound found him in a small, secluded clearing far from the main hunt, a place the Duke often visited for solitude. The scene was unnervingly orderly. The rifle was not cast aside as if dropped in surprise or accident. It was placed neatly on the ground beside him. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken branches or disturbed undergrowth to suggest a fall or a frantic movement. Most tellingly, the angle of the wound was one that would have been nearly impossible to achieve by another's hand, an intimate and deliberate trajectory. In that silent, sun-dappled clearing, the truth was as stark and undeniable as the body itself. The guard's immediate radio call was not one of panic, but of a coded phrase reserved for the most extreme, reputation-threatening emergencies. Within minutes, the family's most trusted advisors and the head of security were on the scene. There were no cries of anguish, no outbursts of disbelief. Instead, a chillingly pragmatic discussion ensued, conducted in hushed, urgent tones. The Duke had been struggling with a severe and previously hidden depressive illness, a fact known only to his inner circle. More pressingly, his vast business empire was poised on a knife edge. His personal leadership was the linchpin holding together a fragile web of international investments and investor confidence. The public revelation that he had taken his own life would have been more than a personal tragedy. It would have been interpreted as a sign of instability, triggering a stock market collapse that would vaporize fortunes and cost thousands their jobs. His death by accident was a manageable tragedy. His death by suicide was an economic and social atom bomb. And so, the guard's duty shifted in that moment from protecting the living to protecting the dead and the legacy they left behind. He became an active participant in reconstructing the scene. With a grim, methodical precision that would haunt him forever, he used his own rifle to fire a single shot into a nearby tree, creating the ballistic evidence of a stray bullet. He then carefully rearranged the Duke's body and clothing, scuffing the ground around him to simulate a slip or a fall. He did not do this alone. He was following the quiet, agonized directives of the Duchess herself, who understood that her children's future and the stability of countless employees depended on the lie they were now telling. The most surreal and heartbreaking moment came when the local police and coroner arrived. The guard, the man sworn to tell the truth, looked them in the eye and calmly described the fictional accident, his voice steady, his demeanor that of a consummate professional managing a crisis. His impeccable reputation and decades of service lent the story an unassailable credibility. No one thought to question the account of a man who had literally taken a bullet for the family in the past. The emotional toll of this complicity was a life sentence of quiet torment. The guard attended the grand state funeral, standing rigidly at attention as world leaders praised the Duke's strength and character, each word feeling like a personal indictment. He accepted the condolences offered to the security team for having witnessed such a terrible accident, each handshake a reaffirmation of the deception. For years afterward, he was responsible for maintaining the lie, deftly deflecting the occasional persistent journalist or conspiracy theorist with a rehearsed blend of feigned sorrow and firm dismissal. His confession, decades later, was not driven by a desire to clear his own conscience, but by a need to finally separate the man from the myth. He wanted the world to know that the Duke was not just a titan of industry, but a human being who had succumbed to a private, invisible pain. In breaking his vow of silence, the guard performed his final act of service, not to the family's name, but to the truth of the man he had failed to protect from himself, offering a testament to the immense, hidden cost of keeping up appearances in a world that cannot bear to see its heroes falter. This unique role of confidant often begins not with a dramatic event, but in the quiet, lonely spaces between public appearances. After the last guest has departed a glittering ball, when the final toast has been made, and the palace halls or mansion corridors fall into an echoing silence, that is when the true isolation of the privileged becomes most palpable. The bodyguard, ever present, becomes a fixed point in a world of relentless sycophants and social climbers. Unlike friends who might gossip, family members with dynastic agendas, or staff who serve at a distance, the protector is a constant, neutral presence. They have no vested interest in inheritance disputes or social climbing. Their sole purpose, at least initially, is the principal's safety. It is this perceived lack of ulterior motive that makes them the perfect, and sometimes the only receptacle for a truth too heavy to carry alone. The confessions they hear are rarely about grand scandals or illicit affairs, at least not at first. They begin with small, vulnerable admissions uttered during a long midnight car ride or in the hushed stillness of a private library. An heiress might confess a profound sense of emptiness, a feeling that her life is a beautifully staged performance for an audience she despises. She might speak of the crushing pressure to marry for status rather than love, or her secret envy of ordinary people whose choices are their own. A prince might admit, his voice barely a whisper, that he feels like a prisoner in his own gilded home, trapped by the weight of a crown he never asked for and a destiny he cannot escape. These are the deepest fears and regrets that can never be shown to the public or even to most of their inner circle, for fear of appearing weak or ungrateful. This dynamic fundamentally transforms the nature of the bodyguard's duty. They become a keeper of emotional secrets, a role for which there is no training manual. They are privy to the raw, unvarnished truth of a crumbling marriage, listening as their principal describes the coldness in a spouse's eyes or the agonizing loneliness of sharing a royal bed with a stranger. They hear regrets about paths not taken, the artistic career abandoned for duty, the true love forsaken for a dynastic alliance. The protector becomes a living diary, absorbing stories of private humiliations, hidden anxieties, and silent tears shed behind closed doors. This is a form of protection that goes far beyond physical safety. It is the safeguarding of a person's most fragile and authentic self. The psychological weight of this intimacy is immense for the bodyguard. They must master the art of listening without judgment, offering silent support without ever crossing the line into offering personal advice or opinion. Their face must remain a calm mask, even as the revelations shock or move them. They must absorb these emotional truths and then lock them away, maintaining perfect professional composure the next morning as they stand guard during a formal breakfast with the very family members their principal just condemned as cold and manipulative. This requires a level of emotional compartmentalization that is extraordinarily difficult to maintain, creating a silent burden that the bodyguard themselves can never confess to anyone. They are the strong, silent shoulder for the world's most powerful people, yet they themselves have no one to turn to. becoming the lonely keepers of the world's most heartbreaking secrets. Behind the glittering facade of tiaras and triumphant balcony waves, some of the most fiercely guarded secrets are not affairs of state, but affairs of the heart and mind. This next confession pulls back the curtain on a battle waged not in public view, but in the suffocating silence of a private suite, where a bodyguard's duty expanded from deflecting bullets to desperately trying to shield a fragile spirit from breaking. His principal was a young princess, the darling of the nation's press, her image a carefully curated portrait of youthful vitality and effortless grace. The public saw a radiant young woman fulfilling her destiny. Her guard saw the terrifyingly still figure who would sometimes stare out a rain-streaked window for hours, her eyes holding a depth of sorrow that no official portrait could ever capture. The first signs were subtle, a series of small changes in behavior that only someone observing her around the clock would notice. The vibrant energy that once made her bounce into a room was replaced by a heavy, leaden quality to her movements. The easy, infectious laughter that charmed diplomats during state dinners became less frequent, replaced by a polished, silent smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her longtime bodyguard, a man we'll call Gregor, initially attributed it to fatigue from a relentless schedule, but soon the pattern became undeniable. He noticed her picking at exquisite meals, pushing food around her plate until it was cold, and then claiming a lack of appetite. He observed the dark circles that even the most skilled makeup artists struggled to conceal before public appearances. The most telling clue was the change in her sleeping patterns, evidenced by lights burning in her private apartments long into the night and the palpable exhaustion she carried through her days. The crisis point arrived on the morning of a major public event, a garden party for thousands. Gregor, following protocol, entered her sitting room to confirm the day's security timings and found her still in her robe, curled on a sofa, staring blankly at a wall. She hadn't slept. She hadn't dressed. The team of stylists and assistants were waiting nervously in the hall. When she spoke, her voice was a flat, hollow whisper. "I can't do it, Gregor. I just can't put the face on today." In that moment, he understood this was not simple exhaustion or a passing mood. This was a profound crisis, and his most important job that day was not to get her to the garden party, but to protect her from it. What followed was a masterclass in clandestine crisis management, a silent operation run with the precision of a military drill, but with the compassion of a hospice nurse. The first call was not to a palace superior, but to a discreet private number for a psychiatrist whose name appeared on no official court roster. Using a pre-arranged code, Gregor canceled all her public engagements for the next 48 hours, citing a sudden, severe migraine, the only acceptable excuse in their world for a complete withdrawal from public life. He then became a logistics commander, orchestrating the secret movement of medical professionals. Doctors would arrive not at the palace's grand entrance, but would be ushered through a service door usually reserved for laundry and groceries, their medical bags hidden in plain leather satchels. Appointments were scheduled for the deepest hours of the night, their cars logged in the security book under false names and fabricated business purposes. Gregor's role became a bizarre and deeply human hybrid of protector, nurse, and confidant. He was the one who ensured her tea was always warm and that the heavy curtains in her room remained drawn to create a calming gloom. He learned to distinguish between her need for solitude and her fear of being alone, sometimes simply positioning himself silently in a corner of the room so she would know she wasn't by herself. He intercepted well-meaning but overwhelming visits from family members, gently turning them away with vague assurances that she was resting comfortably. His most harrowing duty was the constant, silent assessment of risk that went far beyond any external threat. He found himself discreetly removing sharp objects from her environment, not as a protocol, but out of a gut-wrenching fear for her safety. He would note the location of every medication bottle, counting pills with a quiet dread after each doctor's visit. The psychological toll on him was immense. He was trained to analyze crowds for a potential assassin's tell, to plan escape routes from armed attackers, to take a bullet without a second thought. But he was utterly unprepared for this invisible enemy, this slow, quiet war against a shadow that lived inside the person he was sworn to protect. The constant low-grade fear for her well-being was more draining than any high-alert security detail. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying the day's events, searching for any sign he might have missed, any word of comfort he could have offered. His confession reveals that the greatest weight he carried was not the secret itself, but the profound helplessness he felt watching someone he deeply respected endure a pain he could not physically stand against. He was guarding a life, but the battle was for a soul, and his most powerful weapon was a silence filled with compassion. Of all the secrets a bodyguard might be asked to keep, few are as chaotic and morally murky as those born from the unchecked hedonism of the ultra-wealthy. This particular confession plunges us into the heart of a sweltering summer night in Newport, where the Atlantic breeze carried not just the smell of salt, but the overwhelming scent of champagne, expensive perfume, and impending disaster. The setting was a sprawling Italianate mansion known as Seacliff. Its marble terraces and manicured lawns transformed into a bacchanalian playground for the sons and daughters of America's industrial royalty. For the security team assigned to the event, the night was less about protection and more about containment. Their job was to ensure the chaos remained firmly within the high stone walls that separated the family's private world from prying eyes. The bodyguard at the center of this story, a man named Leo, had worked similar parties before. He was accustomed to the standard excesses, the broken antique vases, the couples disappearing into hedge mazes, the occasional drunken tumble into a fountain. But as the night wore on, he sensed a different, more dangerous energy taking hold. A new, unvetted crowd had arrived from New York, a fast-living set known for pushing boundaries. The party's soundtrack shifted from jazz to something harder and more frenetic. Waiters, under strict instructions from the young heir hosting the event, began circulating trays that held not just canapes, but small, ornate boxes filled with a rainbow of pills and vials of fine, white powder. The line between a lavish party and a free-for-all had been officially crossed. The crisis announced itself not with a scream, but with a sudden, chilling pocket of silence amidst the roar of the party. Leo, making his rounds, noticed a small group clustered outside a pool house, their faces etched with panic instead of revelry. Pushing through, he found the source of their fear, a young man, the son of a railway magnate, lying motionless on a chaise lounge. His skin was a ghastly, pale gray, his breathing shallow and irregular. An empty vial and a silver straw lay discarded on the tiles beside him. This was no simple case of having too much to drink. It was a medical emergency of the most severe kind, a direct result of the chemical buffet the host had so recklessly provided. In that moment, every protocol Leo had ever learned was rendered useless. A call to the local Newport police or an ambulance was the obvious human response. But in this world, it was the one option that could never be taken. The scandal would be nuclear. The headline, "Railway Heir Dies of Overdose at Vanderbilt Estate," would destroy multiple families, trigger endless lawsuits, and stain the host's name forever. The young man's life was hanging in the balance, but his social life, and that of everyone present, was also on the line. Leo's radio crackled with a code for a status Bravo emergency, a signal that brought the entire security team converging on the pool house. Their mission was no longer to guard the party, but to erase it. The first and most critical phase was medical. Fortunately, the team included a former Army medic, a man who carried a private, comprehensive medical kit for precisely this kind of off-the-books crisis. While other guards quickly erected a screen using gathered towels and furniture, the medic went to work, administering a powerful stimulant to jumpstart the young man's failing system and placing him in a recovery position to keep his airway clear. This was emergency medicine performed without lights or sirens, under the frantic gaze of terrified socialites. The only soundtrack, the distant thump of the party's music that oblivious guests were still dancing to. While the medic fought for the victim's life, Leo initiated the second, more surreal phase of the operation, the lockdown and the cleanup. Guards swiftly and discreetly sealed all exits to the estate grounds, ensuring no one could leave or enter. The host, now sobered by sheer terror, was pulled aside and given his script. He was to make a calm announcement that a minor security issue required everyone to remain in the main ballroom for a short while, where an open bar and fresh trays of food would be provided. Meanwhile, a separate team descended on the pool house area like a forensic cleanup crew. Every trace of the incident was eradicated. The vial and straw were pocketed, spilled powder was wiped away, and any potentially incriminating photographs were forcibly deleted from guests' cameras under the guise of a privacy sweep. The most coldly calculated part of the operation began once the victim had stabilized enough to be moved. He was not loaded into an ambulance, but into the back of a discreet, unmarked van belonging to the security team. Leo and the medic accompanied him, not to a public hospital, but to a private medical clinic in a nearby state that was pre-alerted and understood the need for absolute confidentiality. The young man was admitted under a false name, his treatment paid for in cash from an emergency fund, his presence there a secret that would be guarded as fiercely as any state secret. Back at the mansion, the final act of the cover-up was unfolding. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in deceptively peaceful hues, the bleary-eyed guests were not simply allowed to leave. They were presented with a 2-page non-disclosure agreement by stone-faced guards. They were told in no uncertain terms that signing was a condition of their departure. The document was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, threatening financial ruin and social exile for anyone who ever spoke a word about the evening's events. One by one, hungover and frightened, the heirs to America's greatest fortunes signed away their right to speak, their signatures scrawled on a document that would forever bind them to a lie. Leo's confession reveals that the most haunting memory of that night was not the sight of the nearly dead young man, but the sound of pens scratching on paper, the quiet, collective agreement to pretend that a tragedy had never almost happened, all to protect the privilege of those who believed the rules were never meant for them. This immense pressure to protect a principal's reputation at all costs often forces bodyguards into a shadowy legal and ethical gray zone, where their sworn duty to obey clashes violently with their personal moral compass. The command might seem simple at first: ensure we are not disturbed, or make that paperwork disappear. But these directives are rarely so straightforward. They are layered with unspoken implications, understood by both the person giving the order and the one receiving it. To follow through is to become an accessory, to break the very laws they are otherwise sworn to uphold. To refuse is to risk immediate termination, blacklisting from the entire profession, and potentially triggering the very scandal they were hired to prevent. This creates an agonizing catch-22, where every choice seems like a failure, trapping the bodyguard in a no-win scenario designed by the powerful to insulate themselves from consequence. The spectrum of these compelled transgressions is vast, ranging from what might seem like minor infractions to truly grave felonies. On one end, a bodyguard might be ordered to trespass on private property, to retrieve a compromising love letter, or to illegally disable a security camera overlooking a clandestine meeting. These acts feel like a bending of the rules, a necessary evil in the service of a greater good. But the slope is dangerously slippery. This escalates quickly to obstruction of justice, where a protector is commanded to lie to police officers during an official investigation, to fabricate an alibi, or to deliberately conceal evidence that could implicate their principal in a crime. The most severe commands cross into unforgivable territory, being used as an intimidator to silence a whistleblower, assisting in the cover-up of a violent assault, or even being asked to facilitate the transfer of blackmail payments, which constitutes money laundering. In these moments, the bodyguard is no longer a shield. They are a weapon aimed at the heart of the justice system itself. The psychological aftermath of this complicity is a life sentence of quiet turmoil. They carry the ghost of every lie they told, every piece of evidence they destroyed, every law they broke for someone else's benefit. This guilt is compounded by the isolating nature of the secret. They can never discuss it with a therapist, a spouse, or a friend without violating their confidentiality agreement and potentially facing legal repercussions themselves. The principal they protected often remains blissfully unaware of the moral sacrifice made on their behalf, seeing it merely as a job requirement. This creates a deep and abiding resentment that festers over decades. The bodyguard is left alone to wrestle with the fact that their professional integrity, a core part of their identity, was willingly sacrificed to preserve the shallow reputation of someone who may not have deserved such loyalty. The shiny medal received for valor feels like a lie. The real testament to their service is the invisible weight of their crimes. It is this corrosive, lifelong burden of silent guilt that ultimately fuels the most shocking late-life confessions. For many retired protectors, the approach of old age acts as a powerful catalyst for moral reckoning. Facing their own mortality, they are driven by a profound need to unburden their soul and reclaim their own narrative before it is too late. The confession is rarely about seeking fame or financial gain. It is about finally placing the truth above the vow, about seeking a form of absolution that the world cannot give, but that they desperately need to make peace with themselves. They are not just sharing a salacious story. They are attempting to surgically remove a tumor of conscience they have carried for a lifetime. In breaking their silence, they perform one final defiant act of protection, not for the principal, but for their own scarred legacy, choosing to be remembered as a flawed human being who finally told the truth rather than a perfect guardian who lived a lie. The polished marble floors and gilded gates of the estate presented an impenetrable facade of lawfulness, but beneath that pristine surface ran a shadow economy of influence, a system the bodyguard knew as greasing the wheels. His confession pulls back the curtain on one of the most common yet clandestine aspects of protecting the ultra-wealthy: the calculated, routine bribery of law enforcement. This wasn't about dramatic payoffs for major crimes. It was a mundane, administrative form of corruption designed to engineer a frictionless existence for his principal, ensuring the real world and its inconvenient rules simply bent around them. The operation ran with the cold efficiency of a utility bill. Once a month, he would be summoned to the family patriarch's private study and presented with a stack of thick, unmarked envelopes. Each was already pre-addressed with a simple, typed identifier: Chief of Police, North Precinct, Captain Traffic Division, Sergeant Event Security. His job was not to question the contents, but to act as a silent courier, a ghost in the machine of municipal justice. The deliveries were never made at a police station. They occurred in the back rooms of quiet restaurants, the front seats of parked personal vehicles, or the private offices of a sympathetic lawyer who acted as a neutral intermediary. The exchanges were wordless, devoid of the dramatic tension seen in films. A handshake, a briefcase left under a table, a newspaper swapped. It was a practiced ritual between parties who understood the transaction perfectly. The money wasn't a reward for a future favor. It was a retainer, a monthly subscription for preferential treatment. The benefits this subscription provided were vast and systemic. A grandson's reckless driving arrest would vanish from the ledger before the ink was dry on the report. A noisy protest forming outside the family's corporate headquarters would be deemed an unlawful assembly and dispersed with startling speed, long before any media could arrive. Most tellingly, the family's various residences and offices would receive an inexplicably high number of routine patrols, creating an invisible, state-sanctioned security perimeter that supplemented the private guards. The bodyguard's confession reveals the most demoralizing aspect was watching good, honest officers, the kind he had once served alongside in his prior life, be slowly corrupted by the system. A young, idealistic cop would be transferred to the neighborhood, and within weeks, the seasoned veteran partner would take them aside and explain how things work around here, initiating them into the silent agreement that kept the peace and paid for their department's holiday party. For the bodyguard, this duty created a profound and isolating moral schism. He was trained to uphold order and respect the law, yet his primary function was to systematically undermine it. He found himself coordinating not with police, but against them, using his knowledge of procedure to identify its weak points for exploitation. The weight of this complicity was a constant companion. He knew that if this web of corruption were ever exposed, he would be the one facing charges, while the family would feign ignorance, their lawyers painting him as a rogue employee acting on his own. He was the living firewall, absorbing all the legal risk to keep their hands clean. His confession is not one of pride, but of profound shame, a recognition that in protecting a family's comfort, he had actively participated in rotting the very foundation of the justice system he had once sworn to serve. The transition from personal protector to corporate operative represents one of the most insidious corruptions of a bodyguard's duty, a shift that occurred not in a shadowy alley, but in a sunlit corner office overlooking Manhattan. My principal was not a royal or a socialite, but the chief executive officer of a sprawling multinational corporation, a man whose ambition was as vast as his fortune. The assignment began under the familiar guise of executive protection during a critical overseas trip to finalize a multi-billion-dollar merger. My team and I were tasked with securing his hotel, his transportation, and his person throughout the negotiations. It was all standard procedure until the evening before the final meeting, when he summoned me to his penthouse suite and presented me with a small, unmarked leather case. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a weapon, but a collection of the most sophisticated listening devices I had ever seen, miniature transmitters so small they looked like lint, a fiber optic camera disguised as a ballpoint pen, and a series of magnetic receptors. My target was not a potential assassin, but the hotel suite directly below ours, occupied by the rival CEO and his own security team. The directive was chillingly simple: gain covert access and plant the entire array before sunrise. The justification was delivered not with a threat, but with a calm corporate logic. This isn't about stealing, he explained. It's about verification. I need to know if their final numbers align with their public posture. Think of it as an insurance policy for our shareholders. In that moment, my role was completely redefined. I was no longer a shield. I was to become a weapon wielded in a corporate war. The operation required me to use every skill in my arsenal against an unsuspecting civilian target. The first phase was pure intelligence gathering, but of a different kind. I had to study the routines of the rival CEO's security detail, identifying the precise timing of their perimeter checks and the specific blind spots in their coverage of the service corridors. I exploited the inherent trust within the security community, striking up a friendly conversation with one of his guards in the hotel gym, casually learning about their shift change protocols and their principal's fondness for late-night room service. This friendly banter felt like a profound betrayal of a shared professional code. Using this information, I was able to identify a 20-minute window where the hallway was clear and the target suite was likely empty, as the principal was at a pre-arranged dinner. The actual breach was a heart-pounding exercise in applied tradecraft, dressed not in my usual suit, but in hotel maintenance coveralls I had acquired from a locked service closet. I approached the suite. My tool was not a firearm, but a sophisticated electronic lockpick that could decode the magnetic card reader in under 60 seconds. The soft click of the door unlocking sounded like a thunderclap in the silent hallway. Inside, the air was still, filled with the faint scent of another man's cologne. The sense of violation was immediate and overwhelming. This was not the home of a threat. It was the private, temporary residence of a businessman. His personal documents spread across the desk, a family photograph propped up on the bedside table. Working with a speed born of sheer adrenaline and a deep self-loathing, I placed the devices. The pen camera went into a decorative ceramic mug on the desk, perfectly angled to capture any documents laid out. The tiny transmitters were fixed to the underside of the nightstand and the frame of a living room armchair. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, but each second stretched into an eternity. My ears straining for the sound of the elevator or a key card in the door. I was no longer protecting my principal from harm. I was actively harming another man's right to privacy and fair negotiation. The line had not just been crossed, it had been completely erased. The aftermath was the most psychologically corrosive part. The next day, during the formal negotiations in the hotel's boardroom, I stood at my post behind my CO. In my ear was a nearly invisible receiver, feeding me the live audio from the rival CO's suite, where his aides were now discussing their final strategy. I was listening to the very conversation my actions had made possible. My principal would occasionally glance back at me, and I would give a slight, almost imperceptible nod, confirming that the intelligence was flowing. We held all the cards. The merger was concluded entirely on our terms, saving our company hundreds of millions and earning my CEO a colossal bonus. My reward was a quiet, substantial, discretionary payment deposited into a private account, and a sickening feeling that my integrity had been purchased and discarded. I had ensured my principal's financial victory by orchestrating the most profound professional defeat of my own career, becoming a silent, complicit ghost in the machine of corporate corruption. It represents the ultimate professional paradox, where the very discretion that makes you invaluable suddenly marks you as the greatest threat of all. This particular confession comes from a man who served one of America's oldest, most revered families, a dynasty whose name was synonymous with public service and old-world integrity. For over a decade, his career was a model of excellence, promotions, bonuses, and the deep, unspoken trust that comes from years of flawless service. He wasn't just staff. He was a fixture, a familiar and reassuring presence at family weddings, funerals, and quiet Sunday gatherings. He believed he had seen the family at its most vulnerable and its most authentic, and that this shared history had forged an unbreakable bond of mutual respect. The event that changed everything was, by his own account, not a dramatic crime or a passionate affair, but something far more subtly destructive to the family's carefully constructed mythos. It happened during a weekend retreat at their sprawling Connecticut estate, a place the public imagined as a tranquil haven of intellectual discourse and family warmth. The bodyguard was conducting his final security sweep of the main house long after midnight when he heard raised voices coming from the patriarch's wood-paneled library. The tone was not one of a simple argument. It was raw, venomous, and shockingly personal. Through the slightly ajar door, he witnessed a scene that would forever shatter his perception of the family. The revered patriarch, a man celebrated in documentaries for his moral fortitude, was engaged in a vicious, snarling confrontation with his youngest son. The subject was money specifically, the systematic siphoning of millions from a charitable foundation the family used as its public philanthropic crown jewel. The son, who served as the foundation's treasurer, had been funneling funds into a series of failed personal ventures, and the father had just discovered the massive, irreparable shortfall. The language used was what struck the guard most profoundly. This wasn't a moment of paternal disappointment or a lesson in integrity. It was a cold, pragmatic negotiation between two partners in a crime, debating not morality, but damage control. The patriarch's primary concern wasn't for the donors or the causes that would now go unfunded. It was for the inevitability of an audit and the catastrophic press that would follow. He laid out a plan not for restitution, but for concealment, which assets could be quietly liquidated to cover the loss, which friendly auditor could be hired to sign off on the cooked books, and which junior staff member at the foundation could be set up to take the fall as a rogue operator. The guard stood frozen in the darkened hallway, listening as his idol meticulously orchestrated a complex fraud to protect the family name, his voice devoid of the noble timbre he used in public speeches, replaced by the calculating coldness of a seasoned conspirator. He withdrew without a sound, his mind reeling, and prayed the encounter had gone unnoticed. For weeks, nothing happened. Life continued as normal, but the atmosphere had changed. The patriarch's genial smiles now felt like a mask. The family's public proclamations about ethics and giving back rang utterly hollow. The guard performed his duties mechanically, burdened by a truth he could never share. Then, exactly 1 month later, he was summoned to the estate's business office, not by the family, but by a stern-faced lawyer he had never met. There was no discussion, no evaluation, no pretense of performance issues. He was informed his services were no longer required, effective immediately. The reason given was a generic restructuring of security protocols. The dismissal itself was executed with a chilling, clinical efficiency. The lawyer slid a contract across the polished mahogany desk. It was a severance agreement, but the sum was staggering, equivalent to 15 years of his salary, a life-changing amount of money. Alongside, it was a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement, thicker than any he had ever seen, its language brutal in its scope and permanence. It stipulated that he could never speak of his employment, the family, or anything he had seen or heard while in their service. It barred him from working in private security anywhere in the country for a period of 5 years. In exchange for his signature and his silence, the money would be his. If he refused, he would be dismissed with a standard 2-week severance, and the family would use its immense influence to ensure he never worked in the field again. The message was clear and undeniable. This was not a reward. It was a purchase order for his integrity and his future, a transaction designed to permanently neutralize a walking, talking liability. He signed, he took the money. He walked away from the only career he had ever loved or known. His confession, offered decades later, is steeped not in anger, but in a profound, lingering sadness. The money provided financial comfort, but became a permanent monument to his own complicity. He had been fired not for a failure in his duty, but for excelling at it too well, for being so observant, so present, that he had accidentally seen behind the final curtain and witnessed the fragile, ugly machinery that powered the dazzling public show. His silence was the final essential service he rendered, the one thing they needed from him even more than his protection. He wasn't let go because he knew a secret. He was let go because he was the secret, a living piece of evidence that had to be securely and permanently archived. His loyalty purchased and shelved like a dangerous document locked away in a vault. But what powerful force could ever compel a person to shatter a lifetime of silence, to break a vow that has defined their very existence? The decision to confess is never made lightly, and the motives that finally crack that formidable armor of discretion are as complex and varied as the secrets themselves. For some, it is a late-in-life reckoning with their own mortality, a powerful urge to unburden their soul of a truth they can no longer carry to the grave. After decades of holding a mirror to the lives of others, they feel a profound need to finally see their own reflection in the historical record, to whisper, "I was there. My story matters too." This is rarely an act of betrayal, but rather a final, poignant act of loyalty, not to the institution they served, but to the human being at the heart of the secret. They may believe that history has cruelly misjudged their principle, and their testimony is offered as a corrective, a chance to show the world the vulnerable, real person behind the polished public myth, to add a layer of heartbreaking humanity to a one-dimensional caricature. Financial incentive, of course, is a powerful and often controversial catalyst. A lucrative book deal or a paid television interview can offer a level of financial security that makes the professional and social repercussions seem a risk worth taking, especially for a retiree living on a modest pension. Yet to reduce these confessions solely to a cash grab is to misunderstand the profound psychological calculus involved. The money often serves less as a primary motive and more as a tangible justification for an action they have already wrestled with for years, a form of compensation for the certain exile from their professional community and the inevitable storm of legal challenges that will follow. It is the key that unlocks the vault, but it is rarely the reason the vault was filled in the first place. The repercussions of breaking this silence are immediate and severe. Within the close-knit world of high-level protection, the confessor is immediately and permanently branded a pariah. They are seen as having violated the most sacred tenet of their profession, and their name becomes synonymous with treachery, making them untouchable to any future employer. The legal fallout is equally daunting. They are almost invariably sued for breach of confidentiality, with the full force of a family's limitless legal resources aimed at burying them in litigation and seizing any profits from their story. But perhaps the most complex consequence is the one they often least expect: the erratic and deeply personal reaction from the families involved. While some dynasties respond with cold, furious denial and aggressive legal threats, others react with a surprising, almost resigned silence, a tacit acknowledgement that the truth was always a temporary tenant, and its lease has finally expired. The guard's legacy is forever split. To the public, they may be a brave truth teller, but to the world they once inhabited, they are simply the one who spoke, their lifetime of dutiful silence instantly erased by a single stunning act of disclosure. And so the final stunning truth emerges from the shadows, not from the crowned heads or the gilded heiresses themselves, but from the silent sentinels who stood perpetually in their periphery. These confessions have ripped away the velvet curtain of power and wealth to reveal a stage filled not with pristine icons, but with profoundly, heartbreakingly human characters. We have journeyed through a landscape of secret rebellions and forbidden loves, of harrowing addictions hidden behind crown jewels and desperate acts of salvation performed in the dead of night. This is not a world of simple scandal, but a complex tapestry of emotional extremes of profound loneliness existing within the most crowded rooms, of earth-shattering fear masked by a serene public smile, and of desperate acts of courage performed by those paid to be invisible. The real revelation is that these protectors were never merely employees. They were the living, breathing archives of the most dangerous truths. They became the unexpected narrators of history's most intimate chapters, the keepers of secrets that could rewrite legacies and shatter dynasties with a single whispered sentence. Their confessions force us to confront the immense and often unbearable human cost of a life lived in the public eye. We see that the true weight of a crown is not measured in gemstones and gold, but in the countless suppressed desires, the stifled tears, and the lonely sacrifices made on the altar of duty and expectation. The glittering facade of immense wealth is revealed to be not a shield, but a gilded cage, often trapping its inhabitants in a life of performative happiness and isolating privilege. These stories ultimately redefine the very nature of loyalty and betrayal. We are left to wonder, was the ultimate act of loyalty the decades of impeccable silence, or the final, courageous decision to speak a painful truth into the light? The bodyguard who breaks their vow is not simply a traitor to a code. They are a witness for the human spirit, testifying to the universal aches of the heart that not even the highest walls or most formidable fortunes can keep out. They remind us that behind every grand title and every legendary fortune, there beats a heart susceptible to the same vulnerabilities, the same passions, and the same desperate needs for connection and authenticity that define us all. So as we leave this hidden world of whispered truths and sealed fates, we are left with one final, lingering question that hangs in the air, as tantalizing as any secret yet untold. If these few, staggering confessions have so fundamentally altered our understanding of history's most guarded figures, what other earth-shattering truths are still waiting patiently in the shadows? What stories are currently being lived and silently witnessed that will one day emerge to rewrite everything we thought we knew? The silence, it seems, is never truly permanent. It is merely waiting for the right moment and the right person to finally give it a voice.